I feel like the way I see it, I feel like that this hate and lack of acceptance and downright, hostility towards trans women, especially, I think that is just a manifestation of internalized misogyny, to be honest. Um,
Wow.
because we are taught as women, just talking as a woman,
Mm.
because I have that experience, we are all taught to, it's a very subtle thing, isn't it? Because we are all taught to behave a certain way. We're all taught to look a certain way. We are taught what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And we learn to police ourselves and each other in that. Like there's a lot of hostility and like competitiveness between women. Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to make a contribution, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this third Reflections episode, Katie interviews me as I reflect on further conversations I've had with gender diverse folks, what I've learnt about gender, as well as my own journey, and how I and the podcast have evolved over a year and a half since the podcast started. We also talk about imposter syndrome, intuition and following the flow, prioritizing self-care, expanding on pronouns, improvising and thinking on the spot, reclaiming labels, coming out of the spiritual closet, how the lines between being on the outside and being on the inside are blurring, and that being an ally benefits us all, not just those we are being allies for. It was recorded on the 15th of February 2022. Now let's get into the episode. Over to you, Katie. What's your first question?
Well, first up, big congrats on the number of downloads so far. I hear it's over, or see it's over 20k. It's more than 20k, isn't it? How does that feel?
It kind of feels surreal. It's not something I ever really expected to happen. And in another way as well, I feel like sometimes you hear from people who've got 100,000 downloads or 1 million downloads, and you think, wow, that is just, I can't even. And I feel like, yeah, I wonder how it's going to feel when I reach, I don't know, 50,000 or 100,000, how that's going to feel. So
I
in a
remember
way,
how
it feels
excited you were.
surreal.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, it feels surreal, but in another way, it's like, cool. Okay, let's see how this goes. Yeah,
Yeah, because you were excited when it reached 1,000,
I
and
was.
you can't keep having like 1,000th download birthday party all the time because you'll be
Yeah,
going out all the time. But yeah,
I
it's hit
know.
23,000. So really, your expectations you couldn't even have imagined it growing this big, perhaps.
No, and
But
I had also no idea of like how it was going to progress and in what way, and because I was just taking one step at a time, really, and that's how I've always done it. So
good question.
yeah,
Actually, this is yeah, you might feel unprepared for this. Do you get imposter syndrome doing it?
absolutely, yeah, yeah. Depending on who I'm talking to as well, because like, okay, in one of the next episodes, I have a conversation with Skin from Skunk and Nancy, and I approached her to be on the podcast through her agent, and I had a feeling she was going to say yes, like an intuitive hunch that she was going to say yes. And at the time, this is someone whose music I've been listening to for like 25 years. And when we were having the conversation, I had all these plans, like, when I ask all these things and get clarity on all this and that and the other. And then even after, we were just having a conversation. And afterwards, I was like, oh God, what have I said? Was I just a bumbling idiot? What did I just, there's all this going on. And it's interesting how it shows up more when I talk to some people rather than others. Because I've talked to some other people who are like more in the public eye. Yeah, I think it's levels, isn't it? Because you get used to things and you get used to talking to people in a certain way, but it's also always a really intuitive thing because I kind of feel my way through the conversation, not necessarily what is suitable to ask or what is appropriate to ask, but like where does the conversation want to go, follow the flow of it. And so yeah, for some people you end up talking about really intimate stuff like, body surgeries, that kind of thing. And with other people, it wouldn't even occur to me to ask that because we're not in that place. So yeah, it's very much one of those flow as it goes kind of
The
things.
advantage in the sense that you are the host, the editor, and everything of the podcast. If you were a bumbling idiot, you could edit those bits out.
See, that's good. I don't tend to edit much of myself out really. Just like I said, pauses. Like I said before in the, I think in a previous reflections episode, I only tend to edit out pauses or when someone says a lot, or when I say, okay, I'm just going to check my notes for a minute, or look
Mm.
something up on a website. I edit that out. But besides that, I just try and leave it all in really.
But there was a point sometime over the previous episode set where you started adding outtakes to it, which I think is great,
Yeah, yeah, the outtakes are still fun. And
even if
yeah,
it's a
for the
string of
intro as
ums.
well. Yeah. Yeah, no, that is really fun, and I really like the intro bits as well. Sort of give people a snippet of what's to come, but also it's obviously vague enough to hopefully raise interest and be like, oh, make people think, oh, I wonder what that's going to be about, and it might be what they expect, it might not. So yeah,
Which brings to mind two questions. One, you mentioned Skin, which is I'm really excited for that episode,
yeah,
and I know, and Skin's not your first kind of musician star on there.
right, uh-huh.
Two people you've actually, Sam,
Mhm.
who actually, liked a lot anyway, and then got to interview, so to speak.
Yeah.
This might be a question to save for a future episode, but who would you most want to get on?
Well, I
Or
mean,
do
I
you have
love.
anyone lined up who is,
Mm,
and it doesn't even have to be a celebrity, but is
no,
there
not at
someone you
all.
would like to get
Like
on just because of their views?
I would just love to speak to just anyone with a story to share, which is pretty much anyone, to be honest. It's just, how engaging they are in conversation and how, not even how well they articulate, but it's like, yeah, just people. We're all just people. Celebrities are also people. Sometimes we forget that, I think. But they are just people, just having a chat with a person. And one person I would really love to get on is Shirley Manson from Garbage because I remember going to their not it wasn't a reunion gig, but it was like a gig that they were playing all the songs from their first album with the Pink Feathers. And I remember Shirley at one point she mentioned the word LGBT, and that's when I think I recorded a little video of it. And I remember her talking about gender and allyship and all that stuff. And I just remember saying, sometimes I feel like a girl and sometimes I feel like a boy, something along those lines. And I thought I'd be really interested to talk to her about all this stuff as well. Yeah, so from her perspective, that'd be really great. But also, like, I mean, I have as you know, I have a list, like a Google Doc or a Google Sheet of all like potential podcast guests and ideas and notes and people I have contacted and how many times, and it's vast, it's vast, and it's just people from my friend next door who's trans to Laverne Cox, basically. Just anyone and everyone is on that list that I could potentially have a conversation with. So yeah,
And it's not just about trans either. I think
no,
has the because we discussed this in a previous reflections episode. The
mm,
original formulation was almost 50 Shades of Trans, and then it became 50 Shades of Gender because that
mm.
was more inclusive, perhaps. But
Yeah, and I didn't even know that at the time, but that was so true. Yeah, yeah, hmm
so, I actually want to just go back a second just to ask a very realistic question before we dig deeper into what you've learnt from the
hmm
last season.
hmm
But just something I want listeners really to learn about the podcast is because I know you made some changes to the podcast and going fortnightly and things.
hmm
But how long? Because we only get to listen to a 30-minute episode or an hour-long episode or episode 16, which used to be the longest and which may not be any longer. Which do you
No,
have a longest episode now, or what's the maximum episode?
yeah, I just checked my list, and the longest episode was with Gin Wicked, which is an hour and 24 minutes.
I have been
Yeah.
demoted.
That
Episode 16 in the bin.
was an hour and
But
11 minutes and something, wasn't it?
yeah,
Nice number.
but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what's the shortest then, to your knowledge? 20
The
minutes?
shortest, I think, was 17 minutes.
See, so depending how long, what time people have to spare, there are different episodes.
Yeah,
Perhaps
and there are
people could
some people who
sort
are
by
really
length.
chatty. Yeah, and other people are just like, you have to just probe them and ask questions all the time for
Mm.
them to even want to say something. And that's all cool. So it's very much let it develop as it goes. But also, I think as I've been going, actually, the last or the latest episodes, they've been getting longer and longer on average. Whereas the one from 17 minutes that I mentioned, that was in the first few dozen episodes. That was early on, and I feel
So
like
are
I've
you telling
become.
me you've got chattier and
I
you've
don't
got more
know.
questions as you've gone on, as opposed to
Maybe.
answers?
Yeah, I do feel like I'm sharing maybe more and stuff because I think, as I mentioned in the last one, like a conversation is a two-way street.
Mm.
And I used to think, no, I'm just here asking the questions. I'm just I'm just sitting here. And but yeah, I think I'm more interactive now with people, which feels good. It's good.
Less like a kind of therapist, just like asking you a question then and then just taking notes on you.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
yeah, whether an episode though is like half an hour, or heading up to even an hour and a half,
Mm.
how long does one episode take to
Yeah.
make, and what does it involve? Because
Yeah, well, kind of the whole pathway really. So in October, I decided reluctantly to go to fortnightly episodes because it was naively I thought, oh, this is like a 2 day a week job. I think 2 full days a week, and I was way deluding myself because it was pretty much a full time. It was a full time job energetically rather than possibly sitting down and actually doing stuff, but like the things that go into it and the thought that goes into it and the planning and things like that. It was just pretty much a full time job. And it was starting to weigh a bit heavy on me. And I was just not able to focus on much else anymore at all. So it was just taking over my life in a way that didn't feel balanced anymore. So I then made the decision to go to fortnightly episodes, so once every 2 weeks. And yeah, that did take some doing because there was a lot of inner chatter about that, thinking like, oh, surely that won't do. That's not dedicated enough. That's not enough. There's all that stuff going on. So I had to sit with that for a bit. And then as I sort of just let that be there, I was a bit like, no, I need to do this, for my own sanity, really. And that's been really good. And it actually feels like it's half the episodes, but it feels like less than half the work now. So I feel like it's really released my time and energy. And I feel like I've had more creative ideas and I'm having ideas about how to expand on, the podcast and my own creative practice, I suppose. And yeah, working on like developing an allyship course for one. So that's still in the pipeline. I've tried it one on one with a few people. That's been really good. So I feel like I want to progress that as well. And it's just made space again for more things to unfold. So that's been really good. So maybe now it's more like 2 days a week, actually. you
wow,
know,
I thought it was 2 days when it was one episode a week. So
that's what
that's
I thought
me.
too. But like, yeah, I was
And everyone
really.
else is probably imagining it's an afternoon per episode,
Yeah,
but
I think it
realizing
depends.
it's
Like, if you have help with it, because a lot of people that I know who have podcasts, a lot of them have help. They have like a VA or an assistant or an editor or all that stuff, or a team of people to help them with it, which I don't have as yet, and I don't know because I feel like I'm very much. I want to. I find it difficult to let go of certain things, but also I don't know which bits I could let go of. Yeah, I'm not saying control freak anymore. I'm using better language about myself. So I'm saying things like I'm very particular about things, which is true. So I'm still doing all the same things as I was doing. And there are some things that I might be able to outsource, I think, at some point. Maybe like the getting in touch with people. And I've got things set up and streamlined and templates and everything. Like when someone says yes to being a guest, I send them like the participant consent form and also an email with prep details and things like that, which is pretty generic. I just fill in the details for it. So it's pretty streamlined, I would say.
well, I know you're a
Yeah.
perfectionist, even if you're not going to admit to being a control freak. Um, and
Recovering.
the
Yeah.
perfectionist in you keeps seemingly evolving. The
Yeah.
quality of what's out there on Instagram, on the various I don't think I've ever seen another podcast that is published on so many platforms that have been put on the website as well. But what's new in the last couple of months that can people find on the website? What new resources can they find in terms of how can they look for episodes in different ways or new ways and things like that?
Mm. Yeah, so a friend said to me, God, you've got so many episodes now. She said, maybe you could do something like make a start here page, so people know how to navigate everything. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. So I made it. Yeah, so there's an episode that says that, oh, there's a page that says start here. So there's a list of like, it's kind of a summary about how things work, what kind of conversations there are, and also like the slightly unusual conversations, like different conversations, like the reflections episodes, the panel episodes that they've been. What else? Let me just check actually.
Yeah, because I'm
Yeah,
going to say you
there
might
is.
not want to have your first episode as one that might have a kind of a, I don't know, not safe for work warning on it almost.
Yeah, that's true. There are some that are like like that. So yeah, I'm just on the page to remind myself. So I explain a little bit about like how the website is structured. There's the episode gallery and the episode list and the categories gallery. I also want to make a page where all the transcripts live for people who are
Mhm.
either hard of hearing or deaf, so they can read it all. Or people who just simply prefer reading rather than listening. So hopefully that will all be in one place as well. I've got someone working on transcripts too, which was slowly catching up with, which is great. There was a bit of a gap there because the person that used to do it for me then couldn't do it anymore. So then there's a bit about the categories and labels, also about the other, about sexuality, neurodivergence, etc. There's a bit about that, and then how to find episodes. So you can search the table, you can take the URL and add a name to the end of it, which will take you to that episode of a particular person if you're looking for that. It also lists, there's some resource pages, and then there's a list of players as well. So I've got the reflections episodes, the listener questions, and the panel discussions. And so the listener questions was quite an interesting one because I came to a point where I had two conversations booked with people, and they both fell through in their own way. Yeah. So one I recorded, and then the person wanted to listen to it, and they were not. They had a cold or something, and they weren't happy with their voice, and they said, "I really don't want you to put it out there." And I was like, I was disappointed, to say the least, because I'd spent hours editing this episode, and it was pretty much ready to go. And I was like, okay, then let's not put it out there. And then that was going to be the next episode. But then I knew I had another episode planned with someone else, and I thought, oh, thankfully I can use that episode. And then they were a no-show, so I was like, shit, now I'm here with like nothing. I was really pissed off. Um, and then someone had actually asked me a question. It was a friend of my mum's actually. She asked, can you maybe do an episode on like terminology that's used in the episode? And then I thought, okay, I'll do that then, because I was intent on having an episode. That was actually when I went to an episode every couple of weeks, because that was after 2 weeks, and I thought, well, I need an episode right now. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to leave it another week. And I think you were the one who said, "Oh, just skip a week," and I was like, "No, no, I can't." So yeah, so I went that way. So then I thought, oh yeah, I'll do a listener questions episode. So took that, then updated the whole glossary on the website, and then I expanded the glossary with relevant episodes as well, so people can find a link like what does maverick mean,
So,
and
so an
and
episode
maverick
that
is the
illustrates a
definition of.
term. Yeah.
Yeah, so the term maverick, for example, means this generally, and if you want to hear more about personal experiences, you can listen to episodes with Jay or Renee, that kind of thing. So so that was good. It was kind of like the silver lining, I suppose, to the cloud, because it's not something I think I would have done had I just had the next episode ready, So that kind of just happened. Yeah. I feel like I've been rambling and now I've forgotten what the questions are. I should
No, no,
hold a
no, no.
sign up saying what was the question, because I don't remember.
You probably have that with every interview potentially, but yeah, you mentioned the questions episode and terminology and glossary and things like that, which brings me on to, I guess, the question of what's new, pussycat. No, what have you learnt? And I take this back to, because I was chatting to someone recently and gave them the card to go and listen to the podcast, and I said you had 75. This is episode 75, and they said, but it's 50 Shades of Gender. I said it should be 75 now, and you're going to rename it every 25 episodes. I had to point
Oh
out
my
the
God, the
original.
work that would be in rebranding.
Yeah,
Good grief.
I had to point out the original connection. But
Yeah.
yes, episode 75, we have now exceeded, the number of genders Facebook got in trouble for publicizing a few years back when they had 73 gender options. But the reason I draw that in there is because then if you go through that list of genders, you realize some of them are genders, some are sexualities, and some are other things. So where does the language fit that you have learned even in this last few months again? How does gender fit with trans? What kind of unpack gender a little bit in terms of the variety of who you interview and what new language have you learned. And just to keep your head spinning, what language that you thought you knew might have changed in
Yeah,
terms of meaning?
language, new language learned. Absolutely. Let me just find the episode list tab again. One thing that's changed is like, I thought demigirl, for example, was a bit like trans feminine.
Hmm.
So trans feminine would be someone who's assigned male at birth, but does not. Now I have to look it all up, and because my brain's gone blank.
Because while you're looking that up, language
Yeah.
continues to evolve anyway in the social world of gender and trans. So we used to say, and
Mm.
being trans myself, we used to say male to female in things like that. And now we use
Yeah.
assigned male at birth. So language keeps changing and evolving
That's
even
true,
there.
but some people actually still relate to that. In my episode, I
Mm.
think it was Ray and Charlie Orris. They both use those terms, male to
Oh, F
no,
to
female
M,
to
for
male, F
example.
to M.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So they relate to that. So that's fair enough. Yeah. So like the term trans feminine, for
Hmm.
example, it's used by people who are not assigned female at birth, but are partially or fully feminine in identity. And I thought demigirl was a similar thing, but since then, I've met such a variety of people who also use the label demigirl for themselves, you know. So I feel like that got a bit, because I met one person who identified with the term demigirl, and I think that then maybe gives you a false sense of like, oh, a demigirl is this kind of person, you know, whereas it could be something completely different. So it just kind of emphasized, I think, the need to be really flexible with all these terms
Mm.
because,
So, for
yeah.
example, if someone were to, go on to the episode list and look up all the episodes where Demigirl existed, I don't know how many of you had,
Mhm.
many of you won, but if you were to listen to 3 episodes that all had Demigirl as a tag, you might discover 3 very different ways of defining Demigirl for themselves. So,
Well, Demigirl, I've actually only had one person, but 2 episodes, so that was
hmm.
Kit. I think Demi Boy, I've had perhaps three now, two or three. So yeah, and they're all very different people.
So when you ask someone what their labels or identities are. And I think I do recall in a previous one that you asked someone what the labels are and I said I don't use labels. But but when
Mm,
someone says, okay, these are the terms I use,
mm.
is that kind of followed up with, and what do they mean to you, rather than an assumption of, oh, I know what that means.
Yeah, and the thing is that that's become kind of a thing that's going without saying, because I used to say, how do you identify and what does that mean to you? But now it's more like, let's talk about your gender experience. And the kind of thing like, what does that mean to you? I sometimes use that in a sentence, but very often it doesn't even come up like that. And I feel like I'm in a place where, yeah, of course it's about this individual's experience and it's not about anyone else necessarily. Like if someone says I'm non-binary and this is what it means to me, and someone else might say, well, that's completely different than how I experience being non-binary. You know, it's fair enough, isn't it?
I mean, the variety of topics and people that you put out there, do you fear or concern that maybe one day you get 2 different trans people or intersex people or non-binary people who actually, if they were to even meet in person or listen to each other's episodes, they would disagree with each other quite
Totally.
vehemently about their own language?
Mm. Yeah, they probably would, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know, as long as you don't invalidate the other's experience. You know, it's
So
all
each
it's all fair
episode,
enough.
so would
Yeah,
you say that each episode should be listened to on its own terms, as it were?
totally. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And how does that kind of, how's it affected your views on gender in general now? Because this, I mean, when did you kind of start this now? When was the first episode
What,
last?
the first one that I
Yeah,
released? That
yeah.
was early July 2020.
So it has
Yeah,
been a lockdown project.
it has. Yeah, definitely been a
Yeah.
lockdown project.
But, you know, going into it, what's changed for you about your understanding of gender? Has it become clearer, simpler, harder to understand, more complicated, wider, broader, deeper?
In short, yes. So, yeah, I feel like I have a deeper understanding of it, which has actually made it a lot more foggy,
Yes, I love it.
muddy. So it's like the more I learn about it, the more questions I have. Like the more I learn about gender, the more I'm like, well, what is this? What does this mean? I'm still where I was like last time we talked about this, which was like, okay, so I'm a woman, and that just means I was born with this body, with these genitals, and therefore someone looked at them and said, this is a girl. That just became, I don't know, that just caused me to be socialized and conditioned in this way and have, certain experiences. And that's still where I'm at. So I'm no wiser as to what the term woman means to me. I feel like I can kind of relate to it, and I feel an affinity, I suppose, to other women because we share experiences. So this is something that I talk to, I think, Talea about, which is about womanhood. It's got this collective experience of womanhood, and there's also a very individual experience of womanhood for every woman, I suppose. So yeah, that's really interesting. And that was the episode where we talked about metagender, because they're metagender. And that's like a space outside, between or outside of cis and trans. And I was like, that is fascinating, because cis and trans is kind of a binary of its own. So it was like,
Mm.
wow, mind blown. Yeah.
So this is as much a project for the world as a personal journey of discovery into gender. And
Mm.
almost every episode, do you feel like, oh, I thought that last week, and now I think this.
Mm.
You get a nugget of
There's
new information.
Oh, totally. Like it's not just about the new terms that I'm learning. Like one of them was xenogender, wolf gender. That was an interesting one. So metagender was another one. What else have I got here? Yeah, I've had some interesting. I have had two more in the last 25 episodes. Two more episodes with intersex folks, and that's been absolutely fascinating. And also the retransitioner, Brian. That was a really interesting episode. I mean, they all just have such, they all have just their own presence and energy and stuff, and it's just they've all got their own, like,
And
I
so,
don't know
what does
even.
retransitioner mean? Is that like detransition by another label, or what?
Yeah, I suppose. So Brian was talking about, so rather than saying he detransitioned, he said he retransitioned, so going from A to B to
Mm,
C, not from A to B to A.
like it.
And I thought that was really interesting because, like, yeah, detransitioning is a really controversial subject, and unfortunately it's kind of, there is a small group of people who have that experience, and that is a valid experience that we should be talking
Mm.
about and be open about talking about. But often it gets hijacked by gender critical folks who say, see, no one should transition because it's all wrong for everyone. Do you know what I mean? It's like, no, this is one person's experience, and they can transition and detransition, and they can do it fucking 6 times if they want to. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that's their experience and their choice. And that's not to say that that is the only choice and the only way for everyone. That's just, anyway, yeah. God.
No, I think that's really radical and brave to put that out there as well, because all gender experiences, you might say, therefore, are valid, including ones that go ABC, A to B, or ABA. They
Mm,
should all be part of the human rights, the freedoms that people have
yeah,
to express their gender. So,
yeah,
who knows who you may
hmm,
publish in the future. I'll,
exactly.
I'll go knocking on a few doors and say, "Do you want to be on the podcast?" But I
Yeah, by
love
all
that. I
means.
love the breadth. I love the breadth and the non-judgment around that. So that's really encouraging to hear, particularly in the current climates we do have
Mm,
around gender criticism and things like that, and trans criticism.
yeah,
The that you've
and I,
exploded the myth that there's a
yeah,
stereotype of trans or anything
yeah, and
like
I
that.
was actually thinking, I feel like the way I see it, I feel like that this hate and lack of acceptance and downright, hostility towards trans women, especially, I think that is just a manifestation of internalized misogyny, to be honest. Um,
Wow.
because we are taught as women, just talking as a woman
Mm.
because I have that experience, we are all taught to, it's a very subtle thing, isn't it? Because we are all taught to behave a certain way, we're all taught to look a certain way, we are taught what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and we learn to police ourselves and each other in that. Like there's a lot of hostility and like competitiveness between women. And I was thinking back to years ago when I was watching Big Brother. When I watched Big Brother, there was a trans woman in it, Nadia, her name was, and no one in the house, I think, knew she was trans. She was kind of, I think, outed in the public while it was all going on inside the house. I don't know if I'm not quite sure how it all happened, to be honest, but I think all of a sudden it was like, oh, look at this picture of Nadia before she transitioned, So that was all very non-consensual, I'm sure. I don't know, but I assume it was non-consensual. Anyway, so I remember this scene where Nadia, they had these communal showers, these big shower rooms and stuff. And there was this one scene where Nadia was in the shower and she had her knickers on, but she was topless and she had heels on, I believe. I hope I remember this right. This is just how I
Heels
remember
on
it.
in the
So my
shower.
she had heels on. And I remember just thinking, like, wow, she is really like just reveling in her womanhood and her body and her like she's loving herself and she's loving showing up as herself and who she is. And like there was a lot of, radiating that out. And I think that rubs a lot of us up the wrong way because we
Mm.
get taught as women, like, it's not okay to look like this. You are allowed to be this way. That is not okay. That is not acceptable. Only this is acceptable. So when you then see someone being all the things that you're taught not to be or be proud of yourself to be, that is like conflicting, like it hits sore points in us. And I think then we react and act out and, act maybe towards we react to that person like how dare they what are we actually saying though in that situation, like how dare they love themselves, how dare they love their body, be proud of their body. And this is a person who's had to go through a lot to get their body to match the inside and like their identity. So yeah, that made me think a lot. I've been recently thinking about it a bit more as well.
So, would you
So
say from that almost a little bit of almost jealousy that, say, a trans
yeah,
woman is celebrating gender rather
yeah.
than because there's this? I mean, I've heard from some gender critical feminists, for example, that people who transition, whichever direction, are playing into the stereotypes of gender. And they're reinforcing, 1950s woman chained to the kitchen sink, wearing corsets and heels and all the things that don't appear so feminist,
Mm,
or things like that. But, in terms of, say, just taking as a subset of all of the episodes, all 75 episodes, the subset that are trans woman, trans feminine, whatever,
mm.
do they appear a homogenous group? Do they appear a group of people trying to roll back gender, trying to act like Stepford wives from the 70s or 50s, Hollywood
Yeah.
housewives or whatever it might be?
See, that's really interesting because like everyone can express their womanhood in the way that they like to, and just because something is considered a stereotype, quote unquote, that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean it's not. If you feel like dressing a certain way, presenting a certain way, acting a certain way, if that feels natural and good to you, it doesn't matter if it's like normal or a stereotype or whatever. If that's your truth, and that's your truth. And Evie Winters recently wrote a really interesting post about it, and she had basically a reply to what to say when women, especially like cis women, I guess, say stop making a mockery of womanhood. And it's like, well, if we're doing that, then so did you. Like when you were a teenager, for example, you were experimenting, like you were growing up as well, not necessarily just teenage years. But a lot of women have experimented and figured out their identity and like how to be a woman. And, a lot of that is obviously filled with conditioning and all that stuff. But still, everyone's had their own journey with it. So of course, trans women have the same journey to go on, and they don't have the luxury if you have that privilege, obviously, but they don't have friends they can ask, and they don't have peers they can talk to. Like, how does this look on me? How am I? Do you know what I mean? All these things that young women go through, and they're like reaching adulthood, I suppose, and entering their womanhood, I suppose, adult womanhood. So yeah, that was a really good post. Actually, I'll share that in show notes.
Have you interviewed people who would identify, say, as trans feminine in some degree, but might express in a less stereotypically feminine way, and people, I don't know, who are almost rebelling against gender in some way,
Mm.
or expressing and presenting in androgynous ways or non-binary ways.
Yeah, it's like I think there's a lot of assumptions, aren't there? If you hear about someone being non-binary, a lot of us automatically assume that their presentation would be very androgynous,
Yeah.
Whereas I know non-binary people who, like, if you see them, you might think that they're just a woman or just a guy or just, do you know what I mean? And there's just so much more to it. So, mm,
Here's a quick left field question, simply because it actually was on Twitter and the news
yeah,
this morning. Pronouns
mm,
and misgendering and things like that continue to make the news from a section of the population who feel like,
mm,
why should I have to even bother with that? Over the last 6 months, year, 18 months, more and more people have been adding them to their email signatures. And most of us have spent
yeah,
our lives on Zoom and Teams and other platforms the
yeah,
last year and a half. And you can put your pronouns on Instagram, on Zoom now. It's a kind of a
mm,
standard question on many of the online formats. And
good.
somebody
I
went
like
and
that.
announced, yeah, a politician of a particular party, other parties are available, but I mentioned it one, people can probably guess which one it was, said that this morning or last night that pronouns are, what is it, some kind of woke psychodrama and a sign of decadence. But how do you feel about pronouns? I mean, do you use what? Why do you put them anywhere, and why do you put them somewhere as an
But
ally
people
or
get
to
all up in
assert your
arms
own
about
agenda?
it. It's like just take a chill pill. It's like seriously. It's like you don't have to worry about the world's pronouns and 7 billion people's pronouns. You really don't have to worry about that. You just meet a person, you learn their name and you learn their pronouns and you learn maybe how they like their coffee and you learn these things about a person. It's just a thing about a person. It's no big fucking deal. Do you know what I mean?
I like
So,
that. So that
yeah,
if we could make kind of getting to know, discovering, or asking someone's pronouns as normal as how do you take your
absolutely.
coffee,
Yeah.
black, white, or with sugar. Him, her, or they, black, white, or with sugar.
Right. And there's
Or any
obviously there's other
combination.
varieties too, but yeah,
Yeah.
those are the main ones. But
And
yeah, so
combinations, yeah. So you can have,
yeah.
white with sugar is like they, she. Or whatever.
Right. Totally. IDIC, infinite diversity, infinite combinations. But yeah, so for me I've been adding them for a while now. So I've got them on Zoom, I've got them in my email footer. So it's just something good to be aware of. And a while ago, the they pronoun is an interesting one because I heard someone use it of me, and then I thought, I don't know how I feel about this. This is a while ago. But then more recently, I've been thinking like she they pronouns. I kind of like it because for me, it feels like someone acknowledges you other in another way, or as not more than, but just beyond, maybe just beyond your genitals, maybe. I don't even know how to put it into words, but I feel a bit like it's good because it makes people think. And I think when people use, if I say, okay, I use they, she, they pronouns for me, like going from she, her to she, they, which I did put on Facebook the other day. That's the only place I've updated them. And it's kind of just something I'm feeling my way around. And for me, if someone then uses, like with people who use pronoun pairs, for example, they like a lot of them, not all of them, I'm sure, but like a lot of them, I think, like them used interchangeably, like even in a sentence. And that can be really confusing for people, which is fair. But also, I feel like it's an acknowledgement of someone seeing you for more than just your gender or for more than just your assigned gender at birth or, and I think there's a lot of like fuck the patriarchy in that. So,
So
yeah,
not reducing someone to their pronoun, but
exactly.
expanding them.
Yeah.
So just a brief kind of reflection comment back on
Mm,
your reflections, so to speak.
yeah.
Does that mean if someone were to call you they, you don't see it as erasing your she-ness, but as being she plus rather than she minus, if that makes sense?
Like to me, it's like a she plus,
Yeah.
actually, absolutely. And for other people, they might be like, hey, that's not right. And they might consider it she minus,
Yeah, which is
and
also
that's
fair.
fair. It's
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's a very individual experience. But for me, I feel like I'm getting to a place, I'm exploring this place where I feel like I like it because it feels expansive, kind of like the term queer for me feels expansive. So I've been using cis queer. I feel like I might drop the term cis at some point and just go for queer because it's simple, and it just feels full of potential and it feels expansive rather than some labels can feel restrictive,
Hmm.
right? And but the term queer for me feels expansive. It makes me feel like, yeah, there's a sense of like, yeah, in that. Um,
Wasn't it the last Reflections episode where you announced, or maybe I pulled it out of you because I knew about it, that you'd gone MX on your bank card or something?
Yeah, yeah. So that's still a thing. Like I said,
Because
ideally,
it
I just don't want a title. I don't want titles. I think they're outdated and ridiculous. That's my opinion. Some people might be attached to theirs. Totally great. Just keep hold of it if that's what you love to do. But I'm a bit like, this is outdated bullshit. Please just stop it. So yeah. So I
does
said,
that
no,
does
no
that feel
title, please.
politic? Does that feel
Yeah,
political or personal for you, or a mixture?
both actually. Yeah, and I feel like to me it's very linked to allyship because I feel like the more that I think about that, the more that I maybe get an idea of what about people who have got like no choices there? Like, because if I have the choice of maybe if I look at it from a again from a woman's perspective, I suppose we've got Miss, we got Mrs, we got Ms. All I don't even know how you pronounce some of the things, but like, and it's to do with our marital status, and it's just such bullshit. So I feel like I'm forced to choose between them a lot of the time because titles are not an optional thing. So I have to choose between them. And I'm like, well, this is bullshit. So I can imagine someone who's actually not relating to any of these terms, like the masculine or the feminine, or male, female, whatever, then that's a step further even. So if I feel like, well, this is a load of shit, or this is just not right, this is incomplete, this is not me, this is, it just is, there's a lot wrong with it. I can only imagine how someone would feel who's actually even further into the perhaps non-binariness or the trans space or wherever, how they feel. They're going to feel that even more strongly. And I feel like all the work we can do as allies, it, we think we're doing it maybe for these folks that are marginalized and oppressed, but really we're doing it for ourselves as well. But most people don't see that. We don't see it that way. But that is exactly what we're doing. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Which brings two questions to mind as well. One, allyship, and I know you've got a background project going on that as well
Mm-hmm.
potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps you might want to say a little bit about the allyship course either now or at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, you kind of started this podcast as an ally, as a self-learning and public learning project about the variety of gender.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you yourself have evolved within it. And you said you might drop the term cis. You're comfortable with the word queer. You're comfortable with MX now.
Mm-hmm.
So how much does it still feel like you're an ally looking in from the outside, interviewing 75 gender diverse people?
Mm.
And or how much do you now feel a little bit on the inside interviewing people who belong
Yeah.
to gender diversity, or do you still feel on the outside looking in as the ally cis or whatever?
You know what? I feel like the outside inside line has been blurring as well. And yeah, that's really interesting. So the other day I was watching Jonathan Van Ness has a new Netflix series. It's called Getting Curious with JVN. And they're from Queer Eye. And yeah, so they're non-binary and they're just delightful. I really love them. And there was an episode, there's a 6 series episode which is just bright and delightful. And then I heard about I think it's the second or third episode, which was with Alok and Geo Neptune. And it was just, I watched it and I was just had so many feels when I watched that episode. I felt like so, I don't know, it just all felt so resonant. And I just felt so involved and connected. And it was like, oh wow, these are interesting sensations. So I don't really know what to make of that just yet. But I do feel like, yeah, the line between outside and inside is blurring a bit. But how much of that is just recognizing all our joint humanity? There is really no outside, there is no other. We're all humans and we're all connected. And yeah, that's just how it is, really. And all the other stuff kind of becomes irrelevant in ways, but also more important in other ways. There's a lot of paradoxes going on there.
So how does that?
Yeah.
I think that I mean,
Okay.
if the destination is just being human, but the journey to it is having all of these labels, and people can search
Mm,
by the tags on the website or the episodes with all the labels. Um,
yeah.
and I imagine, as I say, some people come with 0 labels, and some people come with 25. Is that greed? I don't know. But what
Mm.
does the how do you find your interviewees use their labels loosely or tightly? Do they feel very precious and protective of their label, or do some of them kind of don't mind if it gets a little bit torn off and teared, or slip on, slip
Yeah,
off?
that kind of depends on the label as well. So another episode I got coming up is with someone who's non-binary, autistic, and fat. That's the labels they gave me. And yeah, so I was a bit taken aback by the label fat, because I was a bit like, oh, what is okay to say here? Do you know what I mean? It was even like when talking about neurodivergence, you get like a feel for what the language is all about and what is, not necessarily just PC, but like what is respectful and, you know, all that stuff. So, yeah, and I think it's just so important as well to talk about those kinds of labels, because just like the term disabled, like fat is not a slur, it's a term. And it's so important to just talk about that in a normal way and not normalize it, because again, like gender, it is normal, it is someone's normal, but we need to normalize having these conversations.
Well, with the you said the person who willingly gave out the name,
Yeah.
the word fat
Hmm.
as a label for themselves, because we grow up in
Yeah,
this fat shaming culture. It could be any other
exactly.
label,
Yeah,
and there's a degree to which that person is making a choice to reclaim. Somebody else might disagree with that, but unless
totally.
you, I guess, ask the person, you'll never know their why as to why they're using it.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's also it like if I were to have a conversation with someone about this person, I might say, oh, they are non-binary, they are autistic, but I wouldn't necessarily use the label fat in a conversation like, oh yeah, they're fat. Do you know what I mean? It's just not something that you do. So it's really interesting to get a feel or feel your way through the difference in like the nuances of that language and how you would use it in conversation. I think it's like with disabled, you can say that they're non-binary, they're disabled, they're autistic. Do you know what I mean? Those are all terms that you would potentially use in conversation if it's relevant. But yeah, the term fat is quite, yeah, I feel a bit unsure in that territory. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm
Mm,
finding my way around and learning about the language around that. But I think again, it's important to talk about it. And there might be people who are listening and be like, "Why? How dare you even say that?" Do you know what I mean? I'm like, "Well, okay, but let's talk about it then."
mm.
Yeah.
But is the place where people can talk about it only on the podcast, where they've consented to come on and have you grill them and ask them questions,
Mm.
or have you learnt yourself, or do you think people can learn by listening to the podcast? Better ways to engage with people in real life about, hey, do you mind if I ask you about the way you express yourself? What's that
Yeah,
about?
that's a
I
that's
don't
a
know.
tricky thing.
Is
It's
that
it's
something we
almost
can
like,
do?
yeah, it's that's a tricky thing, because I think it might come up in conversation if you have a certain level of trust and respect that you've built
Mm,
up with someone, like or a friendship or both, that you talk about certain subjects. Whereas other things, I mean, do they even need to come up in conversation? There is so
mm,
much more. Like some, I think it might have been Victor who said, there's so many other interesting things about me, like not necessarily just my gender or my gender experience, and it doesn't even have to come up in conversation. You can actually just have a conversation with someone you just met without talking about it, without talking about gender or anything like that. Yeah, and it is what I do find interesting is that when it comes to gender, especially, people tend to feel like they're entitled to asking invasive questions. I mean, there are spaces to have these conversations, like the human library, for example, is a great space for that.
thank you.
Yeah. But then at the same time, like you can't just throw that into a sentence. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like I thought of an example the other day that even made myself laugh. If that kind of questioning were okay, like, oh, what's in your pants? Asking a
Mm,
trans person what's in your pants and stuff. But it's kind of like going up to a cishet bloke Do you let your girlfriend peg you every now and then? Do you know what I mean? It's a really fucking intimate question. And it's like, that's not something you might even talk to your mates about. And it's intrusive and rude. So just fucking don't. Do you know what I mean? So like, that's just one of the things I was thinking about. By the way, if you do let your girlfriend peg you, good on you. Great. You know, it's just, it's just.
Two things. I think it was Reflections 1 where I threatened you with a swear box, and I think you may have
Yes.
exceeded it this time.
Let's talk about pegging. Okay. Yeah.
But secondly, that brings to mind that thing that we sometimes, when someone asks a question, well, can I ask you about that? And when did you come out as straight? That
Yeah.
kind of angle. We make the assumption that the person who is different is the one who has to do all the work about, coming out and explaining themselves, and that
Yeah.
everyone else, the default, doesn't have to explain themselves or come out or declare.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
So you mentioned, people being more than their gender, and there are other things
Mm.
interesting about me other than my gender or the visual expression of who I am. But I
Mm.
notice in the various episodes there are, some of the people's labels on the posts on the episodes are broader than just gender labels in my
Yeah,
opinion.
they
So
keep expanding. Yeah.
you seem to have some intersectionality, if that's the right
Exactly.
word, with
Yeah, that's
sexuality,
so good.
sex,
Yep.
relationships. What else kind of?
Yeah, like, and also neurodivergence, disability, all those things. Yeah, and it is so interesting because when you start looking into things like gender and what is underneath it all, it becomes really like the intersectionality of it all becomes really obvious with other marginalized, or minority groups, and how we, I don't know, just everything around it. It really opens up a can of worms, to be honest. It's really interesting. And I would love to bring more diversity into the podcast in these other areas, like, even Indigenous folk stories. I've had a
Mm.
conversation with Beverly Little Thunder, who's an Indigenous, she's a Two Spirit Lakota woman. And it's been amazing. And I've been learning about other Indigenous cultures and stuff. And I would love to have more of those conversations. Yeah, that would be great. And I also really love that the way it's expanded because I like to let people give me the labels that, I want to use for the podcast. I say, this is how I name these podcast episodes. So what labels do you use? Gender first and foremost, obviously, but I can also include sex or sexuality, etc. And then sometimes people come up with things that surprise me. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. Like my friend who just said non-binary, autistic, and fat. And I was like, oh, brilliant, let's talk about that. So we did. So that's coming up. Yeah, which is really brilliant.
Now you
So,
mentioned you've had a couple of intersex episodes now across the
mm,
75, haven't you?
I think three.
Um,
Yeah.
which is really great. And a reason I ask that is because obviously, again, on social media world, particularly in the UK, to some extent the US and elsewhere, there is this fight, and there's a hashtag on Twitter, basically sex, not gender, and the idea that sex and gender are at war with each other. That one is exclusively biologically binary, and the other one is completely made up. Without taking a
Mm.
political position, what has been your learning
Oh.
experience as to the kind of the wibbly wobbliness of sex or gender in that sense, particularly with referencing some of your
Mm.
intersex interviewees?
Yeah, well, it's very paradoxical, I guess. And I mean, obviously, I don't agree with that any of that is binary at all. It's like nothing is really binary, is it? What is it? Duality is kind of a myth in a way. Take night and day or dark and light. Like if you take night and day, there might be a point in the night where it's peak night, and there might be a point in the day where it's peak day. But all the time around that is pretty much an in between area. There's dusk and dawn and all the things. So it's similar with sex and gender. So it's like I just see it as a gradient in a way. I feel like I see sex as more of a gradient, but also it's more than that. I think, well, gender especially. I mean, I feel like in my limited understanding of it, it's like the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. So yeah, I feel like I'm at a point where I don't even know what gender is anymore. I just don't know. I'll just, yeah.
But
um
do you know what sex is?
well, it has to do with, like, there's so many, like, physiology bodies, but there are so many factors involved in what make like a male and a female, and it's like there's like, oh, I don't even know. I don't even have
Well, I
words,
think
I think.
metaphorically
Oh my goodness.
use light, which I thought was beautiful. Did you get that from a podcast guest, or is that something you've just
Where did I get
thought
that
about it?
from? I
It's
got it from
lovely.
somewhere that I heard talking about it recently. It was one of the spiritual
Oh,
type.
right.
It was a spiritual type place, which actually brings me to the episode. Once this episode goes live, the previous episode will have been a very different episode. That I've Did I mention that to you? The channeled one that I did with my friend Maida. So Maida channels, and it's listen to the episode. So it's going to be it's a really juicy one. So
Does she channel a gender different to herself? That would be
well, the
interesting.
thing is, gender from a soul perspective, gender is like irrelevant, really. It's souls are not gendered, And I think Ange said the same thing. She believed that in episode 7, she had this sense like that souls are not gendered. That part of ourselves is like obviously here in our human experience, that is part of us, and it matters, and sometimes more than it should matter, in and maybe in the wrong ways and all that stuff. But yeah,
Because
so
we ascribe gender to stuff that sometimes you think, does it even have a gender? Like if you're learning a new language, obviously, if you learn English, everything's genderless, I guess. But if you come from
mm,
a language where you have masculine and feminine, or occasionally masculine and feminine and neuter, or as I was talking to
yeah,
recently, someone who I must get on the podcast for you, a
mm,
non-binary person who comes from a country where they don't have gendered language in a way
mm,
that they and it means that they struggle to express being non-binary in that language because that
totally.
option isn't there.
Yeah,
Or
that
you
is
can
really
have
tricky. Yeah, like English is relatively easy in a way. But I know I also have a Finnish friend, and when she talks about friends and stuff, she always gets his, hers. She always gets it wrong because they don't use those types of pronouns in Finnish language or something.
mm,
I'm no expert on Finnish, but that's what I got. Yeah, yeah. Languages is a tricky one. So yeah, we're quite spoiled here with English, I think, because it's relative. Even the pronoun, like they them, gender neutral pronoun, is just so easy. Whereas in other
mm.
languages, they kind of have to come up with new ones and figure all that out. And there are people who are doing that, which is brilliant. I've talked to a linguist who's like studies French and English, but they are busy at the moment and not able to come on the podcast, which is too bad. But maybe in the future sometime.
Yeah,
So
that
that'll
sounds
be
a
good.
fascinating option, though. Interviewing someone about language
Yeah.
and how we describe gender in language, or how language is gendered, etc., and different
Yeah, it's
cultures as well.
interesting.
Sometimes that they ascribe a gender to. You talked about light; they ascribe gender to the sun and the moon, and they
Mm,
give them a sex, or their ancient myths give them a sexed aspect,
totally.
and that the
Yeah.
worlds are created through the intercourse between planets and gods and all of these things that are
Mm.
metaphors for our existence that we're all struggling to
Yeah,
discover.
and especially in that episode of Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness that I mentioned, Geo
Mm.
Neptune, who's a two-spirit non-binary person, they really explained it in a very, very wonderful way about how I don't even know how to explain it. Watch the episode, I would say. Yeah, so how that two spirit nature is like created or formed in a story. It was really beautiful the way that was done. So yeah,
So, I mean, speaking of people like that, I kind of want to wrap up my questions because I got to save some for the 100th episode. But also,
I'm sure there'll be other stuff to talk about then.
we can't let this
Yeah.
episode beat the record for the longest episode. But how can people get involved, spread the word, support you, perhaps even, obviously share things on social, but also perhaps recommend people to be on the podcast? How do they do that? Particularly if there are areas where you want to see more representation or more diversity from or more discovery
Mm,
of, you know.
yeah. Yeah, well, absolutely happy to learn about. Be great to get some folks on the pod with labels that I haven't covered yet. That'd be brilliant. Also, Indigenous folks would be wonderful, and just like anyone who wants to share their story that thinks they would be a good fit for the podcast. Just go to the website 50shadesofgender.com and fill in the form. Get in touch with us, and yeah, support our project by becoming a patron or buying us a coffee or donating via PayPal. There's links on the website for all of that, and then also learn more about being an ally and come and join the course, which is in progress. So I'll have to put something on the website saying, sign up for, to be notified when it's out or something. Yeah. Sort of hashtag commitment. Yeah. So that was short, wasn't it? Trying to just
No,
be like, oh,
no,
yeah, that. Yeah. Okay.
no. That's great, and it's as I say, it's always a pleasure to see your own evolution and absolutely your commitment to keeping this going, even if sometimes you might think you need to be committed for trying to do that. So glad you've managed to create it a little bit more manageable. But I'm really excited to see who you have on in the next 25 episodes.
Me too. Yeah. I was just going to have a look at my notes to see if there's anything else.
Yeah, I was going to say, anything else you want to share that you felt you haven't touched upon?
I don't know. No, I just start mentioning the channeling episode, and that's, to me, that is kind of that again is like an out there one that I was not sure that I even wanted to share, because Maida offered to me, like she said, oh, since because of the subject, because it's out on Maida's podcast and it came out a few weeks ago, and basically she said to me, do you want it for your podcast as well? Because sometimes people do that, like joint episodes and stuff. And I was like, yeah, brilliant. And then I thought, oh God, how am I gonna introduce that one? So in a way, I feel like I'm coming out of the spiritual closet here. Yeah. So that's, I mean, it's out on Thursday, but I still have to record the intro and outro and all the things for it. So I'll see what shape that takes. So that's exciting.
Actually, it's a kind of a final reflection then on that. Do you feel that, through 50 Shades of Gender, through the podcast, you're normalizing gender or, making it weird? That's nothing to do with just the channeling episode, but I mean, with the
Making it
variety and
weird.
all the labels and the people going, what's Maverick? What's a
Yeah.
demigirl?
No, I don't think making it weird is a thing, but like there is a lot to this and to people's identities, and it's complex, and we all have we have our own view of the world, and it's interesting to realize that none of us probably see ourselves the way others see us and the other way around. We all have a different perspective of life and on life because of our experience and everything. And there's a lot of projection going on, like subconscious stuff. Just because we're having a certain experience makes us think that's how the world is and that's how other people experience themselves. And that's just not true. So, yeah, it's about remembering that, I think, and just being aware that in the end, we've got much more in common than we are different. And it's just good to keep in mind that our common humanity or our mutual humanity. And and like if things, piss you off or trigger you or make you react in a certain way, that's just the space to do some self-inquiry and get curious about what's going on there, It's not a bad thing. It's just how you deal with it is important to, not be destructive with it, be that self-destructive or other, Yeah. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/reflections-3, where you can also read the transcript. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded. That was interesting. I had loads of notes, and it's like, I don't think I've even looked at them except for the bit that said Nadia, and then I thought, oh, I'll talk about that a bit. And
Well,
then
it flowed.
then we ended up talking about pegging, so that's brilliant.
I don't even know what that means.
You don't know what it means. Oh my
I'm
goodness.
asexual. What does pegging mean? Does that mean
That's fair enough. I didn't know what it meant until when did I learn what it meant? Like not a huge amount of years ago, I think.
does it just mean sex or what?
No, pegging is when like someone puts a strap-on and fucks someone up the arse.
So, okay, so I had no clue. That's an outtake now.
That's hilarious. This would be like, just to give you an explanation of the terminology in this episode, pegging means this. Like, holy shit, yeah.
I didn't know what it meant, whether it was
Ah,
a
that's funny.
BDSM term
You know what? That
or
is totally fair, and you need to put, you need to put that in. It's fucking hilarious. Ah, yeah.
yeah, put it as an outtake at the end, not at the intro.
Well, yeah, but then some people might not know what it is. That is
Well, if they
true. But
don't
anyway,
know,
yeah.
if they don't know, they won't be offended until they get
Until they know what it is.
until they get into
Hang
the
on,
detail.
let me just look up what it says on the internet. Hang on, pegging
Well, that's a source of accurate
definition.
information, isn't it?
Definition.
your,
To peg.
your Google
Yeah.
search history would be permanently corrupted now.
Okay, so what is pegging?
Go
And we
to
don't need
Urban
a video.
Dictionary.
Yeah.
I was going to say, don't want to.
Don't need a video. Thank you very much. Basically, okay. So it means anally penetrating someone with a strap on, which is a dildo secured in place by a harness. Yeah. So that's what pegging is. So there you go. There's that.
Well, good job. That's a wrap on another season.
I know, right? It's hilarious because I wasn't sure what was going to come out. And again, I've got this thing about like, oh, fucking hell, what have I said now? Oh my God, I just talked about pegging. But it's like, yeah, I did.
It's normally me who says this, that, the kind of the rude shit on TV or whatever. Now you're the one like going places I wouldn't go.
I am so putting that in the intro. To explain some terminology that's used in the episode, pegging means I'm thinking about it. I might not, but I might. I don't know.
I think it should be an out. I think the definition should be an outtake.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's cool. Actually, I like it. And then people will be like, maybe that are a bit confused. Some people might know what it means and they might just laugh.
No one's going to care if they don't know what it means. But I think the definition and you laughing about the definition is an outtake.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I might put it in an outtake. And then people who listen to the outtake might be like, oh!
Because they'll have all made up their assumptions by then as to what they think it means.
That's
and then
hilarious.
You get to kind of like, oh, that!
Yeah.
Oh, because pegging also in bondage also means something else, because people literally put pegs on their nipples and things.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
You see, so it could have meant that.
Oh, what a versatile term.
Yeah, I was just thinking about hanging out the washing or whatever. No.
Hanging out your washing? Quite unquote.
But yeah, we went to some extra places we didn't plan. That was good. That was interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. I'm still where I was like last time we talked about this, which was like, okay, so I'm a woman, and that just means I was born with this body, with these genitals, and therefore someone looked at them and said, this is a girl, so that's my assigned gender at birth, assigned sex. Seriously, I cannot talk.
I thought you were about to say agina.
That's assigned gender at birth became assigned. Anyway,